Professor Viktal adjusted his tentacles around his favorite plasma pen and surveyed the sea of eager faces before him. Well, most were eager. The Zelkari students buzzed with electric anticipation, their bioluminescent patches flickering in patterns that roughly translated to barely contained excitement. The Morvac delegation sat perfectly still, their stone-like features betraying nothing, while the Quillith representatives chittered softly among themselves, their crystalline eyes refracting the classroom light into tiny rainbows. And then there was Marcus. The human sat slouched in the back corner, feet propped up on his desk like he owned the place. His primitive clothing consisted of some blue fabric wrapped around his legs and a thin covering over his torso that bore strange symbols. The audacity! Here they were, in the most prestigious military academy in the Galactic Federation, and this barely evolved mammal acted like he was lounging in his own dwelling. "Welcome, cadets, to Advanced Weapons Theory," Viktal announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen actual combat. "Today, we will examine the evolution of warfare technology across the galaxy." A chorus of acknowledgments rose from the class. The Zelkari sparked brighter, the Morvac remained motionless, the Quillith chimed in harmony, and Marcus. Marcus yawned. Viktal's eye stalks twitched. In his 3 centuries of teaching, no student had ever shown such blatant disrespect. Perhaps our human representative would like to share what he finds so unstimulating about military history. Marcus looked up from whatever he had been doing with his hands. "Oh, sorry, Professor. Just wondering when we get to the interesting parts." The classroom fell silent. Even the Quillith stopped their musical whispers. "Interesting parts?" Viktal repeated, his tentacles beginning to change from their usual purple to a dangerous shade of orange. What could be more interesting than the development of plasma weaponry, the invention of molecular disruptors, the advancement from crude kinetic projectiles to sophisticated energy manipulation? Marcus shrugged. "I guess that depends on your definition of sophisticated." A ripple of laughter spread through the room. Zara, one of the Zelkari students, was practically glowing with amusement. "Did the primitive just question our technology?" she asked, her voice carrying that particular brand of condescension that only came with superior evolution. Now, Viktal said, though his own amusement was evident. "Let us be fair to our human colleague. His species has only recently achieved faster-than-light travel. Their understanding of advanced weaponry is naturally limited." More laughter. The Quillith began harmonizing what could only be described as mockery set to music. Marcus sat up straighter, and for a moment, something flickered behind his eyes. Something that made Viktal's combat instincts stir uneasily. But the moment passed, and the human's expression returned to its previous casual indifference. "You're absolutely right, Professor," Marcus said. "We humans are pretty primitive. Our weapons are laughably simple. I mean, who needs plasma when you have sticks and stones, right?" The laughter grew louder. Brix, a massive Morvac whose species prided themselves on their military prowess, actually cracked what might have been a smile. "Perhaps the human would demonstrate these stick weapons for us?" "Oh, I'd love to," Marcus replied, his tone so genuinely enthusiastic that it caught everyone off guard. "But I wouldn't want to interrupt the lesson. Please, continue." Viktal blinked both sets of eyes. Something about the human's tone bothered him, but he couldn't quite identify what. "Very well. As I was saying, the development of energy-based weaponry represents the pinnacle of military technology. Observe." He activated the holographic display, showing a sleek plasma rifle that hummed with barely contained energy. This is the standard Federation assault weapon, capable of melting through 6 inches of reinforced durasteel. Range of 2 kilometers with pinpoint accuracy. Rate of fire, 300 rounds per minute. The students murmured appreciatively, all except Marcus, who seemed to be examining the wooden surface of his desk with unusual interest. Now, Viktal continued, warming to his subject, compare this to primitive projectile weapons. The display shifted to show a crude metal tube. This is what humans call a rifle. It uses chemical explosives to propel small metal projectiles. Primitive, inefficient, and woefully inaccurate beyond a few hundred meters. Woefully inaccurate, Marcus asked without looking up from his desk. Certainly. The projectile is subject to gravity, wind resistance, and countless environmental factors. A plasma bolt travels at near light speed and is unaffected by such trivialities. Marcus ran his hand along the edge of his desk. That's fascinating. So you'd say energy weapons are superior in every way? Without question. Only a species stuck in the dark ages of warfare would rely on kinetic projectiles. The class erupted in another round of laughter. Even some of the typically reserved Morvac students joined in. Marcus smiled, but again, there was something in that smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. You know what? You've convinced me. Energy weapons are clearly the way to go. In fact, I bet someone using primitive weapons wouldn't stand a chance against all this advanced technology. Obviously not, Zara chimed in, her bioluminescent patches pulsing with glee. What could a stick-throwing savage do against plasma rifles and force shields? Absolutely nothing, agreed Brix. It would be laughably one-sided. A complete joke, added Crix, a Quilith whose crystalline form refracted his amusement into visible light patterns. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. You're probably right. Hey, Professor, would you mind if I asked a hypothetical question? Viktal was beginning to regret allowing this conversation to continue, but academic protocol demanded he remain open to student inquiry. Proceed. Let's say, hypothetically, that someone with only primitive weapons found themselves in a room full of people with advanced technology. What do you think would happen? They would be eliminated immediately, Viktal replied without hesitation. Advanced civilizations don't achieve their status by being vulnerable to primitive tactics. Right. But what if the room was, I don't know, an enclosed space? Like a classroom? And what if the person with primitive weapons was sitting, say, in the back corner, where they could see everyone and everyone had their backs to them? The laughter was dying down now. Several students were beginning to turn in their seats to look at Marcus, and Viktal noticed with growing unease that the human hadn't moved from his casual position. Even in an enclosed space, Viktal said carefully, superior technology would prevail. Force shields, energy weapons, enhanced reflexes. There would be no contest. Oh, absolutely, Marcus agreed. No contest at all, especially since everyone would be so confident in their superiority that they probably wouldn't even be paying attention to potential threats. The classroom was growing quiet now, the kind of quiet that made Viktal's combat veteran's instincts scream warnings. And of course, Marcus continued, still running his hands along his desk, all those advanced weapons would be completely useless if the person with the primitive weapons had already positioned themselves perfectly and prepared their attack before anyone realized there was a threat. What are you? Viktal began, then stopped. Marcus was still sitting casually, but there was something different about his posture. Something that spoke of coiled energy and perfect balance. I mean, Marcus said, And now there was definitely something different about his voice. If someone wanted to demonstrate just how effective primitive weapons could be, this would be the perfect setup. A room full of overconfident students with their backs turned, all convinced that their advanced technology makes them invincible. Several students were now turned around completely, staring at Marcus. Zara's bioluminescent patches had shifted from amusement to confusion, then to something that might have been concern. "Marcus," Viktal said slowly, "what exactly are you suggesting?" The human smiled, and this time there was nothing casual about it. "I'm not suggesting anything, Professor. I'm just enjoying our discussion about weapon effectiveness. Though I have to say, I'm a little disappointed in your analysis." "Disappointed?" "Well, you've spent all this time talking about the superiority of energy weapons, but you've completely ignored the most important factor in any combat situation." "Which is?" Marcus lifted his hands from the desk, and Viktal's blood froze. In the human's grip was a perfectly crafted spear, carved from what had once been the corner of his wooden desk. The point was sharp enough to reflect the classroom lights, and the balance was so perfect it seemed to float in Marcus's hands. "Initiative," Marcus said softly. The silence that followed was deafening. "When did you—" Brix began, his massive stone form shifting uneasily. "About 10 minutes ago," Marcus replied conversationally. "Right around the time everyone started laughing about how primitive human weapons are. Turns out, all that inferior manual dexterity comes in handy for improvised weapon crafting." Zara's patches were now strobing rapid patterns that clearly indicated panic. You made that from your desk?" "Part of it, anyway. Amazing what you can do with proper leverage and understanding of wood grain. Of course, this is just a demonstration. Wouldn't want anyone to think I was actually threatening superior life forms with my primitive technology." But the way he held the spear, the way he sat with perfect balance despite appearing relaxed, the way his eyes tracked every movement in the room, there was nothing primitive about it. Professor Viktal's tentacles were shifting rapidly through the color spectrum, a sure sign of extreme agitation. His 3 centuries of combat experience were screaming at him that he was looking at a predator, not the primitive savage he had assumed. "The effective range of this particular weapon," Marcus continued in the same conversational tone, "is about 15 feet when thrown properly. Of course, in close quarters like this, you wouldn't really need to throw it. Thrust radius would cover pretty much the entire front row from this position." "This is a classroom, not a battlefield," Viktal managed to say, though his voice had lost much of its earlier authority. "You're absolutely right," Marcus agreed, "which is why I'm just demonstrating. After all, you wanted to discuss weapon effectiveness, and I have to say, Professor, your analysis was fundamentally flawed." "How so?" "You assumed that advanced technology automatically confers tactical superiority, but you ignored positioning, preparation, psychology, and, most importantly, the element of surprise. All the plasma rifles in the galaxy won't help you if your opponent strikes before you know you're in a fight." Marcus stood up slowly, and the spear moved with him as if it were an extension of his body. Every student in the room tracked his movement, and Viktal noticed with alarm that none of them were reaching for their own weapons. They were too shocked, too disoriented by having their fundamental assumptions challenged. "For instance," Marcus said, taking a single step forward, "right now, every person in this room is thinking about how to respond to a threat they never saw coming. Your first instinct isn't to draw your weapons, it's to process what just happened. That's called the OODA loop, by the way. Observe, orient, decide, act. And I'm already 3 steps ahead of you." OODA loop? Crix asked, his crystalline form refracting nervous patterns of light. Human military theory. Turns out we primitive savages have spent quite a lot of time thinking about how to kill things more efficiently. Funny thing about being the physically weakest species on your home planet. You get really good at tactical thinking. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. Then Zara, whose bioluminescent patches had shifted to colors Viktal had never seen before, asked the question they were all thinking. What would have happened if you had been serious? Marcus considered this for a moment, then smiled that unsettling smile again. Well, let's see. Best case scenario for you would be that I could take out maybe the first 2 rows before anyone got their weapons up. Worst case scenario. Well, let's just say that human military doctrine emphasizes the importance of achieving maximum psychological impact with minimal resources. He paused, letting that sink in. Of course, that's assuming I was alone and using improvised weapons. If I had proper equipment and backup, or if this were an actual tactical situation rather than a classroom demonstration, but we're just talking hypothetically, aren't we, Professor? Viktal realized he was holding his breath. Around the room, he could see his students grappling with a revelation that challenged everything they thought they knew about military superiority. You see, Marcus continued, the problem with assuming technological superiority automatically means tactical superiority is that you stop thinking about threats. You get comfortable. You laugh at the primitive weapons and forget that the person holding them might actually know what they're doing. He shifted his grip on the spear slightly, and the movement was so fluid, so perfectly controlled, that it sent a chill through everyone watching. Humans have been killing each other with pointed sticks for thousands of years. We've gotten pretty good at it. And the thing about having to fight your way up the food chain with nothing but cleverness and sharp objects is that you develop a very different perspective on warfare. Which is, Viktal found himself asking, despite every instinct telling him to remain silent, that the weapon doesn't make the warrior. The warrior makes the weapon. Marcus sat back down, placing the spear across his lap with casual ease. But like I said, this is just a demonstration. I'd hate for anyone to think that primitive humans could actually pose a threat to advanced civilizations. That would be ridiculous, wouldn't it? The question hung in the air like a challenge none of them were prepared to answer. Because suddenly, it didn't seem ridiculous at all. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before Professor Viktal cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of his classroom. His tentacles had finally settled on a sickly green color that indicated deep unease. Well, he said, trying to inject authority back into his voice, that was certainly an educational demonstration. Perhaps we should return to our scheduled curriculum. Actually, Professor, came a new voice from the doorway, I think we should continue this lesson exactly as it's going. Every head turned to see Admiral Korrath standing in the entrance. The legendary Thaxian warrior's 4 arms were crossed, and his battle-scarred carapace gleamed under the classroom lights. Students throughout the galaxy knew his reputation. He had single-handedly ended 3 separate conflicts and was considered one of the finest military strategists in Federation history. Marcus glanced at the Admiral with mild interest, but didn't move from his relaxed position. Admiral, enjoying the show? Immensely, Korrath replied, stepping into the room with the predatory grace that had made him famous. Though I suspect most of your classmates are still trying to process what just happened. What do you mean? Zara asked, though her bioluminescent patches were still cycling through confused patterns. Korrath's mandibles clicked in what those familiar with Thaxian expressions recognized as grim amusement. Your classmate just gave you the most valuable military lesson you'll ever receive, and half of you are too shocked to understand it." "It was just a demonstration," Brix protested, though his voice lacked conviction. "Was it?" Korrath moved to the center of the room, his presence commanding instant attention. "Marcus, would you mind sharing with the class what your actual mission parameters were today?" Marcus grinned, and suddenly his casual demeanor made perfect sense. Infiltration and threat assessment. The Academy wanted to know how secure their facilities were against unconventional attacks. The collective gasp from the students was audible. "You mean this was planned?" Crix's crystalline form was refracting light in rapid, panicked patterns. "Oh no," Marcus said, still holding his improvised spear with casual expertise. "The spear carving was completely improvised. I was just supposed to observe security protocols and defensive awareness. But when everyone started laughing about primitive weapons..." He shrugged. "Well, seemed like a perfect opportunity for a practical demonstration." Admiral Korrath nodded approvingly. In actual combat scenarios, Marcus would have been what humans call a sleeper agent. Someone who appears harmless, but is positioned to strike at the optimal moment. Professor Viktal's color had shifted to an alarming shade of yellow. "Are you saying he could have actually harmed my students?" "Harmed them?" Korrath's laugh was like grinding stone. "Professor, if this had been a real infiltration mission, your entire class would be dead, and Marcus would be halfway to his extraction point before anyone even knew there was a threat." "That seems like an exaggeration," Zara said weakly. Marcus stood up again, and this time his movement was different. Gone was any pretense of casual indifference. When he moved, it was with the fluid precision of someone who had been trained to kill efficiently and quickly. "Is it?" he asked, and his voice had dropped to a tone that made everyone's survival instincts activate simultaneously. "Let's see. Zara, you're in seat 3A, front row. From my position, I could reach you in exactly 2 steps. Your reaction time, based on your species average, is 0.7 seconds. My spear thrust would complete in 0.3 seconds. Zara's glow dimmed to almost nothing. "Brix, you're bigger and stronger, but your species' natural armor has weak points at the neck joints. One precise strike would sever your primary neural pathway before you could activate your defensive protocols." The massive Morvac shifted uncomfortably in his reinforced chair. "Crix, your crystalline structure makes you nearly invulnerable to energy weapons, but remarkably brittle against kinetic impacts, especially at stress concentration points, which I identified during the first 10 minutes of class." The Quaileth's musical chiming had stopped entirely. "And Professor Viktal," Marcus turned to face the instructor, "your species' combat reflexes are excellent, but you've been teaching for 3 centuries. Your muscle memory is geared toward academic discourse, not combat response. You'd reach for your plasma pen before your sidearm." Viktal looked down at his tentacles and realized with horror that Marcus was absolutely right. He was indeed gripping his plasma pen. "This is terrifying," whispered someone from the back of the class. "No," Admiral Korrath corrected. "This is reality. And it's a reality that every military officer in this room needs to understand." He moved to stand beside Marcus, and the contrast was striking. The Admiral was clearly a warrior, all sharp edges and barely contained violence. Marcus looked like he could be anyone's neighbor, completely unremarkable except for the weapon in his hands and the calculating intelligence in his eyes. The human military doctrine that Marcus just demonstrated is based on a fundamental truth that most advanced civilizations have forgotten, Korrath continued. Superior technology means nothing if your enemy doesn't fight the way you expect them to. But surely our weapons are still more effective, Brix argued, though he sounded less certain than before. Are they? Marcus asked. He held up his carved spear. This weapon cost me nothing to make, uses no energy, makes no sound, leaves no energy signature, and is completely undetectable by your standard security systems. Your plasma rifle costs more than most planets' annual defense budgets, requires specialized ammunition, can be tracked by its energy signature, and fails completely if I disrupt its power source. Habiku paused to let that sink in. More importantly, I can make 50 of these in the time it takes you to manufacture one plasma rifle, and I can train a soldier to use this effectively in a few weeks, while your energy weapons require months of specialized training. Quantity has a quality all its own, Admiral Korrath added. It's an old human saying, and it's won them more battles than their enemies ever expected. Zara's patches were starting to flicker with what might have been understanding. So you're saying that primitive weapons actually have advantages? I'm saying that calling them primitive is a mistake that could get you killed, Marcus replied. These aren't primitive weapons. They're appropriate weapons. They're designed to be simple, reliable, and effective in situations where complex technology might fail. He moved to the holographic display and gestured at the plasma rifle still rotating in the projection. This is an impressive weapon, don't get me wrong. In open terrain, with good visibility and unlimited ammunition, it's probably superior to anything I could make by hand. But warfare isn't always fought in ideal conditions. The display shifted to show different environments: dense forests, underground tunnels, electromagnetic storm zones. What happens to your plasma rifle in a high-radiation environment that scrambles electronics? What about underwater? In a magnetic field that disrupts energy flow? What if you run out of ammunition in the middle of a firefight? Marcus held up his spear again. This works everywhere. Always. And if it breaks, I can make another one in minutes from whatever materials are available. But surely the range disadvantage, Crix began, is only a disadvantage if you fight at long range, Marcus interrupted. Human military doctrine emphasizes closing distance and fighting in conditions that favor our weapons. We don't try to outshoot plasma rifles at 2 kilometers. We get close enough that your advanced targeting systems can't track us. Then we use weapons that work perfectly at point-blank range. Professor Viktal was beginning to understand the implications. You're describing asymmetric warfare. Exactly. We don't fight fair because fair fights are for sports, not survival. We fight smart. We use terrain, weather, psychology, misdirection, and yes, weapons that you dismiss as primitive because you don't understand their tactical applications. Admiral Korrath stepped forward. Which brings us to the real lesson of today's demonstration. How many of you noticed Marcus preparing his weapon? Silence. How many of you identified him as a potential threat when he first entered the room? More silence. How many of you have your weapons ready right now? The rustling sound as students reached for their sidearms was answer enough. That, Korrath said grimly, is why human military advisors are now considered essential for any serious military operation. Not because their weapons are better, but because their tactical thinking is different. They see threats where others see harmless civilians. They find weapons where others see furniture. They turn disadvantages into advantages. Marcus sat back down, but kept the spear across his lap. The thing about being the weakest species on your home planet is that you learn to be creative. You can't outmuscle a predator, so you outthink it. You can't outrun it, so you outmaneuver it. You can't overpower it, so you use its own strength against it. And that philosophy, Admiral Korrath added, has made humans the most effective military consultants in the galaxy, not despite their primitive weapons, but because of their primitive thinking. Zara raised a tentative appendage. What do you mean by primitive thinking? I mean thinking like someone who can't afford to lose, Marcus replied. When you have overwhelming technological superiority, you can afford to fight honorably. You can follow rules of engagement and worry about minimizing collateral damage. When you're fighting for survival with nothing but sharp sticks, you use every advantage you can find. He gestured around the room. Every single thing in this classroom can be turned into a weapon, if you think about it correctly. These chairs, perfect for blocking doorways or creating improvised shields. The holographic projector, remove the focusing crystal and you have a blinding strobe light. The ventilation grates, access to the building's infrastructure. Students began looking around the room with new eyes, seeing potential weapons and tactical positions instead of familiar classroom furniture. But the most important weapon, Marcus continued, is the one between your ears. All the advanced technology in the galaxy won't help you if you don't understand your enemy. And most advanced civilizations don't understand humans because they think our simplicity is a weakness. Whereas it's actually your greatest strength, Admiral Korrath concluded, simplicity means reliability. Reliability means you can depend on your weapons and tactics when everything else fails. The Admiral moved toward the door, then paused. Your assignment for next week is to study human military history. Pay particular attention to battles where technologically inferior forces defeated superior enemies. I think you'll find it educational. He left, but his words hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus stood up and walked to the front of the classroom. The students tensed, but he simply placed his handcrafted spear on Professor Viktal's desk. You can keep this, he said with a smile that was now entirely friendly. Consider it a reminder that effectiveness isn't always about complexity. As he headed toward the door, Zara called out, "Marcus! Wait!" He turned back, eyebrows raised. How long did it actually take you to carve that spear? His grin was answer enough, but he said it anyway. About 30 seconds. The rest of the time I was just adding finishing touches and waiting for the right moment to reveal it. The silence that followed his departure was different from the tense quiet of earlier. This was the silence of minds being fundamentally changed, of assumptions being shattered and rebuilt. Professor Viktal picked up the spear with trembling tentacles. The craftsmanship was flawless, the balance perfect, the point sharp enough to penetrate any armor in the room. And it had been made from a piece of furniture with nothing but human hands and human ingenuity. "Class dismissed," he said quietly. But as the students filed out, each lost in their own thoughts about primitive weapons and advanced warfare, none of them noticed the small smile on Professor Viktal's face. Because, for the first time in 3 centuries of teaching, his students had learned something that might actually keep them alive. And sometimes, the best lessons were the ones that scared you most.